Important. If you pick up at the beginning of chapter 25, verse 1, then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to. The kingdom of heaven shall be likened to. And so there's a transition here. We walked away for a time there in Matthew chapter 24 concerning these things, concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, one of the things I learned yesterday was that the only other time Rome destroyed temples, and I mentioned a week ago that Rome doesn't destroy temples. They never destroy temples. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Of all the conquests that they had, there was one other time where they destroyed temples, and that was Carthage. It was one of their earliest destructions of a city, and it was because they were trying to attack Rome. And so they went in, and they literally did not leave a stone upon another stone. Does that sound familiar? That's exactly what Jesus said would happen here. And that's exactly what happened in that situation. No other time did Rome do any business with temples. They left them alone. They left them standing. It would be the only structure in the entire city, but it remained. But in Carthage and in Jerusalem, there was something special about those two places. There was something significant to the Romans in this sense, or in Jerusalem, something significant to God. And it was the need for the temple to be destroyed. So it was an incredibly beneficial place, but I want to get in a mindset here. We're dealing with something slightly different. He says the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to. So he's making some comparisons that he has made already as far as comparing things to the kingdom, not these comparisons specifically. The world, when you deal with them, they expect Christians to yield to their every whim and want. It's weird that they are like that, but they approach Christians as if a Christian should give them whatever they desire, whatever they ask. That they would desire peace at any cost. A Christian would. They act like that. And it's a weird situation to be in when people are surprised that peace at any cost is not on the menu. Peace, certainly, within the right parameters, and that's my desire ultimately, to have peace with even the people of this world, but not at any cost. And I think we're going to see that as we begin talking here in Matthew chapter 25 concerning specifically this verse. But as we go along, we're going to hopefully challenge some of our own views even, some of the ways we think and the way that our minds oftentimes run in that way. And brethren, I want you to know one thing, certainly, that there is a line. That there is a line that should never be crossed. And we're going to talk about that line first. Now, we might discuss where exactly that line should be drawn. But drawn it must be. Look at here in Matthew chapter 25. Look at verse 1 again. He says, then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. This was an incredibly important event in any young woman's life. This was probably the most important event in this young woman's life up to this point. This is something that many women prepare for, that they look forward to. Many women, as they get older, some men even, they plan their weddings. And sometimes even as a child, they will plan their weddings. And sometimes you draw that book out and you look through it. When you were 7, these are the things that you came up with. And as a 20 or 30-year-old, perhaps you look it over and you're like, that was pretty ridiculous. But the idea of a wedding for a lot of people is a significant thing, is an important thing in their psyche and in the way they look at things. And these 10 virgins were looking forward to this event to meet the bridegroom. They took their lamps and they went out to meet them, but not all of them were the same. Not all of them were the same. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were fools took their lamps and took no oil with them. They determined that the amount of oil that would come standard in their lamp would be sufficient to carry them until the bridegroom arrived. Usually suspected to be 2 to 3 hours. Not the bridegroom's arrival, but the amount of oil that you had. And so if it gets dark about 7, which is usually the case, then you're looking at 10. Well, there's a problem. There's a problem. These foolish virgins, as the Bible describes them, brought only enough oil if everything worked as planned. And I got to tell you, things don't always work as planned. And so you must prepare. And he says, He says that the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. They took an added amount of oil. They carried some else with them so that they would have enough. They were prepared. It says there in verse 6, it tells you when, and at midnight a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming. Go out to meet him. Because verse 5, we find that he was delayed. He was delayed and they all fell asleep. And it's midnight now, which is far removed from the estimated 2 to 3 hours that oil is going to last. And so for these foolish virgins who did not anticipate the possibility of a delay, whether the delay happened or not, they didn't anticipate any delay. They thought everything would go as usual, that everything would happen exactly how they predicted it would happen or how it was supposed to happen. And life doesn't work that way. But rather, these wise individuals, they brought an additional amount of oil. And so what we see here, if you pick up in verse 6, the bridegroom comes, then all those virgins arose, trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. We don't have enough. But the wise answered, saying, no, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourself. There's an important lesson here. You can't get other people to heaven at your own expense. We read something just a moment ago, and you might have wondered why we read it, because it's such a major part of Christian theology, of an understanding of God's will. Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 and 37. What's the greatest commandment? Now, Jesus would say the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. The greatest commandment, which is the one you should follow above all else, love God with all that you are. Your relationship with God must come first. And that is a hard thing for Christians to wrap their head around. You either have people who only think of themselves or only think of others. Finding that in between, where we think of ourselves in every way we should and we think of others in every way we should, is not an easy position to get in. It's not an easy place to find ourselves. It takes work and dedication and sometimes personal training, not on ellipticals and whatnot, but to challenge ourselves regularly. Because your relationship with God must be your highest priority. It must be where you put all of your onus. And we're going to talk about some things that go along with that. But this is one of the most important lessons I see the brotherhood needing at large. You cannot sacrifice your own soul to help others to get to heaven. You have made a shoddy deal. You have made a terrible error. Your relationship with God, and I'm going to say it again, your relationship with God must come first. There are things that you ought not do because of your issues with temptation, because of your struggles in the world. There are decisions that you need to make that are going to hurt. There are things that you cannot do or should not do because of who you are as a human being. You need to respect your limitations in your spirituality and where you are in your life. And you need to protect what is most precious, and that is your soul. And I see people making decisions that they feel are in the best interest of others, and that's fine. But oftentimes, they will subject themselves to outrageous torture to their own detriment. I mean, Peter in 1 Peter talks about Lot, who tormented his righteous soul by living in Sodom. And there could have been a number of reasons why he stayed in Sodom. And we could come up with a lot of reasons why Lot might stay in Sodom and rationalize decisions like that. And we can look back and say, well, he obviously shouldn't have pitched his tent towards Sodom. But for him to get out of that situation would have taken a great deal of personal strength, which Lot obviously didn't have. He didn't possess that level of strength. Well, you need to. You need, whether you've been in Sodom for a day or 50 days or 50 years, we need to have the resolve to leave Sodom behind, to walk away from it, regardless of what reasons we might have to remain or what people might be clinging to us. Our relationship with God, I'm going to say it 5 or 6 more times by the time this lesson is over, I'm sure. relationship with God is and must be number one. And it's a biblical concept. It doesn't feel right sometimes. It doesn't feel like a biblical concept, but Jesus demonstrates it in the greatest commandment. Your relationship with God must come first. Which means you must make the proper preparation. Now, it would have been easier for these wise ladies to take simply the lamb, like the foolish ones did. It wouldn't have been as difficult or as time-consuming to prepare. It wouldn't have been as expensive on the front end. There are a lot of reasons why these foolish women didn't bring enough oil. But these wise women, these wise virgins, recognized the importance of the event and that they did not want to miss it. This event was so important, they would make every preparation. They would make sure that everything was set, and they would challenge. Maybe they thought through it the night before, and they asked all these what-if questions. What if he's delayed? What if something happens? And they make the proper preparations, and so should you. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 24, he says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it." These foolish women, they didn't run in such a way that they might obtain it. They ran in such a way that they might have obtained it. That there was a chance that they would get it. They didn't make certain that they would receive it. They were give themselves good odds. And the thing about 1 John, and I know I talk about loving books a lot. There's a lot of books that I really love. There's about 66 of them that I'm real fond of. But the reason I love 1 John is because of his dedication to the concept of knowing where you stand with God. And in the world at that time, with the Gnosticism, the people who thought they had an enlightened view of the world, that God had given them some additional understanding, and they looked down on normal people who didn't have this enlightened view. And John blows it out of the water. He's just like, that's the dumbest thing ever. You can know where you stand with God. I love reading 1 John because I get the sense from John that I can know where I stand and need to know where I stand with God. I need to respect that, sure, it's by the grace of God, but by the grace of God, He's also given me promises. He's also instructed me on how I might be saved and what expectations He has on me. We're not wandering blind through this world, or we don't have to anyway. And this day does not have to approach us as a thief in the night. We don't have to worry about that day because we can be prepared whether it comes today or in 100 years. Like these wise women, we can be prepared and we can make the preparations as necessary. It's a very important day coming. Are you prepared? Are you ready for it? Or are you like these foolish women sitting with hours of oil when it may be days, when it may be a lifetime waiting before you? We need to be set that we are going to be ready regardless of delays, regardless of when it comes. I'm going to be there. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 13, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Have you done all? Are you putting first the kingdom of heaven and His righteousness? Are you putting your first priority on your relationship with God? Because there are great rewards. He says, and all these things shall be added to you, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Here, the wise women are brought in, but when the foolish women come back, it's too late. And he says that he doesn't know them. He doesn't know who they are because they have missed the deadline. Continuing in Matthew chapter 25, he talks about talents, which is an interesting discussion as well. What is a talent? And that's something that the religious world at large isn't positive, but most people speculate the talent was considered 1 year's wage approximately. So $30,000, a common laborer's wage for 1 year. The talent is a weight technically, so it's 100 pounds of silver if it's a silver talent, 200 pounds of gold if it's a gold talent. Now those have varying degrees of value, but it's usually considered to be about 1 year's wage for a common laborer. But you have to understand that we're talking about field work. There is this desire in us when we talk about talents, and I'm sure when I preach about talents or when we discuss talents, and I talk about people having talents, they say, well, I don't have as many talents as this other person has. And I'm always wondering, like, what do you mean by talents there? You mean you're not the best at something? Because that's not what talents means. It's 1 year of a day laborer's wages. He's a field worker, and there's nothing wrong with that. He works in the field. He harvests the grain. He pulls the tassels off the corn. He bales hay. I've done that. And while it's sometimes painful and sometimes it's really hard, it doesn't take a great deal of what we would consider talents. So what's he talking about here when the Lord gives 3 men, one of them 1 talent, one of them 2 talents, and one of them 5 talents? What does he mean when he says that? That he wants them to use those talents. The expectation is there because the 2 with the highest amounts, the 5 and the 2 talent men, understand that they should be making something out of this wealth that he has entrusted them with. It's not for their benefit. It's not so that they can go and squander it or spend it on things, but it's also not for burying, so that they can just give it back. The Lord has entrusted talents in you. And we're not talking about being an NBA player, because that's a very select group of people. I thought, as I was growing up, that I would play for the NBA. I was an idiot. And my mom, never wanting to discourage me from wild and ridiculous ideas, the most she would oftentimes say was, maybe we should work on a backup plan. Backup plan, you're right, Mom. There was no way. There was no way. But Jesus isn't talking about some incredibly athletic ability. He's not talking about wild prestidigitation or sleight of hand where you're a magician. He's not talking about a PhD or a CEO. He's not talking about rocket science. He's talking about field labor. That means that that's something that we are all capable of. He's talking about using the time and talents that you have to work for the Lord in whatever capacity. And how many references are there throughout the New Testament? It's, in fact, the highest number of references to an occupation is to a farmer. He utilizes this analogy not because it's simple or not because it's not hard, but because it matters so much to what he's talking about. To grow, to cultivate, to sow the seed and to watch it grow and to wait patiently for it to develop, and then inevitably knowing that most farmers, they don't eat all the harvest that they bring in. In fact, if you eat all the harvest that you bring in, you're a pretty bad farmer. You're supposed to keep some to sell so that you can buy other things that you may need. That's what we need to be. We need to be people who recognize that while the work can be difficult, while the work can be hard, it doesn't take a rocket science to do it. What it takes is someone to strike out into the deep. What it takes is for us to be committed to His will to such a degree that we will plant even though we won't harvest right away. That we will sow the seed and put it wherever we might distribute it so that it has the opportunity to grow. That one day, with the Lord's help, that it might grow and there might be a harvest. We get the wrong idea, and I think it's by our own commission. We like having the wrong idea about talents, because in our minds it gives us an excuse not to work. Well, Chris, I'm not good at that. Fred, neither am I. Well, Chris, I'm scared of public speaking, or I'm scared of talking to people. I don't know how they'll respond. I'm right there with you. It doesn't change that they need the gospel, and that we are called to work in His kingdom, to labor in His vineyard, to be workers in the Lord. It doesn't change that the results of this parable either, that those with 5 and 2 talents were rewarded handsomely, and the one with 1 talent who hid it and then distributed it back to his master, knowing that he was who he was not seen in such a bright light. In fact, he was thrown out of the kingdom. We need to use them. We need to develop them. There are talents that each of us possess. And you're not a great baker right there with you. Man, there's a lot of these. But there's a lot of things that I am capable of doing. And I need to challenge myself, and you need to challenge yourself to become a better worker in the Lord. To find what things you can do and do them. And find what things scare you and do them anyway. It's the only way you're going to get better. It's the only way you're going to overcome. How did I get over a fear of talking to people? I talked to people. I'm not kidding. That's all I did. And I would talk to people in public areas, and I'd go out and about. It still scares me. I still don't like talking to people out in public. But I do it because they need the gospel, and I need to express the talents that God's given me. Fear cannot hold us back. We need to be people who go out, strike out into the deep. Because when we do, we'll find the fishing's better out there. Put it to use. Christian principles we need to admonish in ourselves. We need to develop. We need to prioritize. We need to put to use the talents that God has given us and develop more. And maybe the most important thing that we can have as Christians is perspective. Perspective changes everything. When I was in preaching school, when I first started preaching school, I remember one of the instructors, I can't remember who it was probably Tom, because Tom Miller was one of those guys who would just be blunt with you, and by the time you were done, you felt this big, right? And you realized all the things you weren't doing right, and how they needed to change. He was real good at that. And I mean that in all the right ways. He was an incredible instructor. He was one of my favorites. We need to learn to think like the Lord. And he sat us down and he said, you don't have to be here. You don't have to do your homework. You don't have to read the assignments. You don't have to graduate. How many times have you heard your student, or you yourself have said when an assignment came up, I have to get this done? You don't have to get that done. And how many times as a preacher do you suppose I have heard, do I have to fill in the blank? Do I have to be baptized? Do I have to attend worship? Do I have to give? Do I have to help others? Do I have to stop doing this thing that God considers a sin? Do I have to start doing this thing that God considers an advantage or something that should be done? No. And people are always weirded out when I say that. They say, do I have to do this? No, you don't. You also don't have to go to heaven. I mean, there's a choice here. And it's not do these things and go to heaven. It's really manage the way you look at things, or you're very unlikely to make it. If we are constantly thinking about all the things we have to do, rather than all the things God empowers us to do, it allows us to do, we get to do, like I get to come here and I get to speak to you all about something that's incredibly important to me. God's Word. And that changes the way my job works. It changes the way I look at my role in the congregation. There's a lot of things that if I didn't have the right perspective, it would kill me. It would kill me. Little by little, I would die every day doing them. But when I change the way I look at things, when I change my perspective on things, it changes everything about me. We have to change the way we look at Christian works. Do I have to do these things? No. And in truth, the way we should look at it is that I get to do them. Like evangelism. We've talked about this before. God could have come up with a million other ways, more than a million, I'm sure, because He's God, of distributing the gospel to the people, of making sure they understood what was expected of them. And yet He involved humanity. That was, in my estimation, one of the worst ideas He's ever had. When He involved us, He set it up to, we would mess up everything. And so we kind of have in a lot of ways. God could have come up with way more efficient ways of doing it, way more practical ways of doing it than involving us. He could have dropped Bibles from the sky, I've talked about this before, with outlines or highlights of the passages that were really important. He could have page marked each individual thing that each individual person needed. That would have been a lot more helpful or a lot more efficient than dealing with humanity. But he dealt with humanity not for his own good, but for ours. Because when we get involved, we mess things up. But when we have the right perspective, it's not a matter of I have to, because God doesn't need us to do it. He wants us to do it. We need to want to do it. Because it's who we are, not what we have to do. Look at Matthew chapter 25. Look at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as the shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he'll set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. That's a lot of things that these sheep were involved in, and look at their response. We're going to see the comparison here in just a moment. Then the righteous will answer him. Look at what they say. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it for one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it for me. Now you look at the alternate. He tells those on the other side, the goats, that they didn't do these things for him. Well, when did we see you? Same question they ask. When did we see you? And the answer is neither of you saw. And the answer is none of us will see Jesus in our life, not in the flesh, not in that way. We won't see Jesus when we go out into the world and we see situations going wrong, and we say to ourselves, nor should we, hey, this is an opportunity for me to do a good thing for Jesus, to build up my credit. But that's how we treat it sometimes, isn't it? That's sometimes what motivates us. Well, I really like to go to heaven, so I should do these things. That is the wrong perspective. A necessary perspective, perhaps, at first, but certainly not where we should end up. Certainly not where we should be as New Testament Christians who understand the glories of God and the majesty on high, that we think of some checks and balances. Look at what the difference is here. When the sheep saw a problem, they wanted to fix it, not because they'd get credit for it. When the sheep saw an issue, they wanted to resolve it and help. They wanted to be there for people, not because they were going to get some eternal credit that would go to their ultimate reward. They did it because it was who they were and who their God was. And look at the alternative, the goats. How do they handle these situations? They come to a situation, they see something that's amiss, that could be rectified, that they have the ability to change, and they don't do it because they don't perceive that they will get a credit for it. Brethren, that's too often how we look at things. That is too often how we look at things. As a system of credits and taxes, rather than an opportunity to live for Christ. To be who Jesus was as close as we can, because we're going to mess it up. I mean, we're who we are. The goats won't help someone unless they get credit out of it. The sheep weren't even concerned about credit. They worked because it was who they are, because of who God is. I'll tell you, I am happy to hold people's hands as they learn or as we learn together sometimes. I'll tell you, I don't know everything. That may come to a surprise to some of you. Some of you know that, absolutely. But we might work together on something, or I might help someone along with something they're trying to learn. I might hold their hands, but I'm tired of shoving people in the right direction. I mean, when we talked about live streaming the services for people who are sick, who are sick a lot. Looking in the back there. They're not sick anymore, I'm real glad, but live streaming for people who can't get out, for our shut-ins, and folks around the world who may be able to hear the gospel because of it. And one of my first concerns was, will it discourage some people from coming? And I had to reprimand myself. I am not devoid of these thoughts. I am not secure from this kind of thing. I have these kinds of thoughts too. And thinking that, and then realizing how dumb of a problem that was, made me real sad. I can't worry about what people who aren't committed to being with the Brotherhood are going to do, because they're not committed to being with the Brotherhood. I can't change that, right? I can't shove them in the right direction, or I shouldn't anyway. I'm tempted to sometimes. And I have a few times before. It didn't work out very well, because people don't like being shoved. Weird. But holding their hands, helping them, absolutely. I love holding people's hands. I love helping them, encouraging them, building them up. I love sharing the word with people. But only people who really want to work. Because if I put things in people's hands, and the elders can certainly confirm this, if you put things in people's hands that aren't really wanting to do them to begin with, they're not going to get done very well. But you put something in someone's hands who wants to work, it'll get done in the best way possible. Not your way always, but the best they could possibly do will be done. And that's what we need, not only as a congregation, as the church at large, but more precisely, that's who we need to be. Right? And I don't need to be shoving people to get them on the right track, to get them going in the right direction. But I'm always tempted. I'll be honest with you. It seems like a real good solution to the problem, and sometimes we do that. Sometimes we shove when we should encourage. But I can't change your soul. I can't change your perspective. I can help. I can encourage you. We can have lessons like this that I hope begin to change the way you look at things. Works out in the community, things you can be involved in, both internally within the congregation and externally. That instead of saying I have to go to services, perhaps we start saying I get to go to services. And I'll tell you, behavioral changes. I always hated the behavioral side of psychology. The behavioral side of psychology has some legitimacy to it. Changing behaviors does end up changing the way you think about things. It's crazy, the way your mind works. So sometimes it's, when your kid says, do we have to go to services today? Or sometimes when your parents say, do we have to go to services today? Maybe you turn it around. No, we get to go to services today, right? Oh, do we have to go to the gardens? Do we have to talk to this person about Jesus? Do we have to do this or to do that? No, we get to. And when we change the way we look at things, it changes the way we accomplish things. It changes the world around us.